Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our third, can you believe it, already number three? Our third episode in our series covering Julius Caesar, his rise, and the subsequent Gallic War. Before we get started today, I just want to thank everyone who is joining me right now. We are doing this on Twitch, as we do on Wednesday evenings, starting at 6 p.m. Japan time. If you would like to join us, if you're watching us on YouTube, feel free to join us live. You can hang out and join the discussion. If you're in the stream right now and can't stay for the whole thing, we will, of course, be uploading on YouTube for everyone to enjoy at their leisure. So thank you, everyone, so far for your support. I really do appreciate it. We're nearing almost 800 followers now on Twitch. It is a fantastic feeling. And I'm hoping to get that number up to about the same level on YouTube as well. So if you haven't subscribed already, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And we'll be continuing this series for a ways to go. I probably mentioned it at the outset when we first started this series, but my goal here in talking about both Caesar and the sources for the Gallic War was twofold. First, I wanted to bring a fuller picture to everyone regarding the campaign itself, but also to Julius Caesar and his motives. And second, I was hoping to refute some of the accusations and slings that have been levied against Caesar and his actions in Gaul. Some people have gone as far as to say it was a Celtic genocide. Of course, that's been a position made famous by people like Historia Civilis and Dan Carlin, other Roman YouTubers, and it's my hope to refute the claim on both a historical and even a definitional basis. And in order to do that, we're progressing through each year one by one. Last time we covered the first year of the Gallic War. And just to do a little recap, it started with the migration of a tribe called the Helvetii. And the Helvetii were a tribe near enough to Roman territory, and they wanted to pass through one of Caesar's provinces in order to get to the west and to resettle. They were, of course, not alone. They were joined by several other tribes, and they numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Now, Caesar rebuffed their advances and denied their request to pass through Roman territory to achieve their goals. He gave several reasons for this, and upon being denied, of course, the Helvetii were not content to just take no for an answer, and several of them tried to cross and attack the Roman fortifications. Of course, this fell through. Caesar gave pursuit, and then the Helvetii tried to go through the territory of the Sequani, and managed to do that, and on their way west began attacking Roman allies who came to Caesar for help. Now, Caesar had a mandate to protect, of course, Roman territory and the territory of his allies, and so he acted on this request and gave battle, eventually defeating the Helvetii. Importantly, after the major battle against the Helvetii, in which he was victorious, everyone who surrendered to him all the Helvetii who were still alive, he ordered back to their homes. He had the surrounding tribes agree to provide them with food, supplies, materials, because again, they had burned their homes and fields before they had left on their attempted migration. They had nothing left. And so Caesar organized help from the other tribes to ensure their continued survival. And his reasons for doing this wasn't, of course, just generosity. The Helvetii did share a border with the Rhine, which means a border with Germany. And Germany, of course, Germania, and the Germans were and will continue to be a great threat to the Roman Empire throughout its history, and Caesar understood this. In fact, this would be tested the very next year. Actually, not even the very next year. The same year, when several of the Gallic tribes called a secret meeting with Caesar to tell him of the tyranny and crimes against them committed by a German king named Ariovistus, who had originally crossed the Rhine at the behest of the Sequani to help them defeat an old rival of them, the Aedui, who were Caesar's ally, or Rome's ally, I should say. In fact, it was a representative of the Aedui named Diviciacus who first came to Caesar for help and managed to negotiate among him and the other tribes. And so, despite several attempts at a diplomatic solution, eventually talks fall through, and once again Caesar was forced to give battle. Once again, he emerges victorious, the Germans are defeated, and forced back across the Rhine. Ariovistus himself does escape, but the power base of the Suebi is completely shattered. And so that brings us to the next year, to 57. Now, just to remind everyone, Caesar in 1 year has been involved in two major conflicts. One on behest of the Gallic states, many of the Gallic states themselves, against Ariovistus, and another at the behest of their allies, but also in their own interest in the defense of the Roman state and provinces against the Helvetii. And despite some misconceptions, this means that the initial conflicts in Gaul really were just as much in the interest of the Gauls as it was the Romans. Caesar has been called to aid, and he has provided said aid. He has given conditions, they have been fulfilled. And one might think after this it could all stop now. But as we'll see, it does not. Because there will be aggravators from this point forward that will come in various shapes and sizes, who will be testing the patience, the will, and the might of the Roman nation. With that, as I said, we are moving into the second book, 57 BC. The book is titled as so, AUC 697, so the year would be 697 by the Roman calendar. The consuls are Publius Cornelius Lentulus Spinther and Quintus Caecilius Metellus Nepos. And the chapter is entitled Defeats for the Belgic Peoples. So let us begin. Caesar says, as we mentioned above, Caesar was in Nearer Gaul. There he heard a host of rumors, confirmed by a letter from Labienus, that all the Belgae who make up 1/3 of Gaul, as we said before, were hatching a plot against the Roman people and exchanging hostages. The reasons for this plot were as follows. First, they were afraid that our army would march against them now that all the rest of Gaul had been subdued. Secondly, they were being stirred up by a number of the Gauls, some of whom had been unwilling for the Germans to have any further involvement in Gaul, and were equally reluctant for the army of the Roman people to overwinter and become established there. Others were of a volatile and unstable disposition, the sort of men who delight in changes of rule. Yet another group incited the Belgae to conspire because it was common in Gaul for men who possessed some degree of power and the means to hire support to seize regal power, something which would be more difficult to achieve under our rule. These reports and Labienus's dispatch prompted Caesar to enlist 2 new legions. In Nearer Gaul, and once the campaigning season had begun, he sent his legate, Quintus Pedius, to lead them to further Gaul. He himself went to join his army as soon as a supply of fodder became available. To the Senones and the other Gauls who were neighbors of the Belgae, he gave the task of finding out what the Belgae were doing, and of keeping him informed of developments. They all loyally reported that gangs were mustering, and an army assembling in one place. Then he knew it was imperative that he set out for the territory of the Belgae. Caesar secured a supply of corn, struck camp, and moved out. Within about a fortnight, he had reached the borders of the Belgae. He arrived unexpectedly, and more quickly than anyone had foreseen. The Remi, a Belgic people closest to Gaul, sent him envoys called Iccius and Adicombrius, who were both leading citizens. They declared that they were entrusting themselves and all their possessions to the good faith and power of the Roman people. They did not agree with the other Belgic peoples, nor were they plotting against the Roman people. They were prepared to surrender hostages and obey orders, and to admit Caesar into their towns and assist him by supplying corn and other necessities. All the rest of the Belgae were ready for war, and the Germans dwelling on this side of the Rhine had joined them. They were all in such a state of fury, Iccius and Adicombrius concluded that it had proved impossible to dissuade even the Suessiones from joining in on the conspiracy, though they were close kinsmen and shared the same jurisdiction and laws, and also the same government and magistracies. When Caesar asked the 2 envoys about the Belgic states, how many were under arms, and what their strength in war, he discovered that most of the Belgae were of German extraction, and had long ago crossed the Rhine and settled on the western side because of the fertility of the soil. They had forced out the Gauls who dwelt there. In our fathers' time, when the Cimbri and Teutoni were harassing the whole of Gaul, only the Belgae had stopped them entering their own territory. So it transpired that they had acquired an aura of great authority and courage in military matters by the memory of this achievement. The Remi claimed to have complete information about the Belgae's numerical strength, because they were closely connected both by physical proximity and ties of marriage. They knew how many men each leader had pledged for the war at the General Council of the Belgae. The strongest people among the Belgae in terms of bravery, influence, and numbers were the Bellovaci. They could supply 100,000 armed men, and had promised to select 60,000 from that number. At first, they demanded command of the entire campaign for themselves. Their neighbors were the Suessiones, who possessed extensive and fertile territories. Within living memory, they had a king called Diviciacus, who was the most powerful in the whole of Gaul, and controlled a large portion of that region and also of Britain. Now their king was a man called Galba, because he was a just and cautious ruler. Everyone agreed to give him overall control of the war. He had control of 12 towns and was pledging 50,000 soldiers. The Nervi, a people dwelling far off and considered particularly fierce by the Gauls themselves, pledged a similar number. The Atrebates pledged 15,000. The Ambiani, 10,000. The Morini, 25,000. The Menapi, 7,000. The Coleti, 10,000. The Veliacasis and Viromandui, 10,000 between them. And the Aduatuci, 19,000. The Remi thought that the Condrusi, Eburones, Kairosi, and Paimani, who are collectively known as Germans, could supply about 40,000 men. Caesar addressed the Remi with words of generous encouragement. He ordered their whole senate to come before him, and the children of leading citizens to be brought as hostages. These demands were scrupulously and promptly carried out. Caesar encouraged Diviciacus the Aeduan warmly and explained how important it was for the Republic and the common good to keep the enemy groups apart, so as to avoid having to engage with such a huge force all at once. This could be achieved if the Aedui brought their forces into the Bellovaces territory and began to plunder their lands. With these instructions, he dismissed Diviciacus. Once he observed that all the Belgic forces had gathered together and were marching towards him, and learned from the scouts he had sent out and from the Remi that they were getting close, Caesar hastened to take his army across the river Ain, which is the most distant reaches of the Remi's territory, and pitched camp. Thus one side of the camp was protected by the river bank, and the rear was secure from the enemy. Moreover, it ensured that the Remi and other peoples could ferry supplies to Caesar without danger. There was a bridge over this river. Caesar garrisoned it, and further along the river left his legate, Quintus Titurius Sabinus, with 6 cohorts. He ordered him to build a camp with a 12-foot rampart and an 18-foot ditch. 8 miles away from this camp was a town of the Remi called Bibrax. Whilst actually on the march, the Belgae suddenly turned to attack it with great force. The town barely held out on that day. The siege method of the Gauls and the Belgae are very similar. First, a line of men is placed all around the walls, and they begin to throw stones in the direction of the wall. When the wall has lost all its defenders, they form a tortoise, come in close, and undermine the wall. On this occasion, the task was easy, for when such a vast number of men was throwing stones and missiles, there was no possibility of anyone remaining standing on the wall. In command of the town was Iccius, one of the Remi, a man of good birth and reputation among his people. When night fell, he sent a man who had been part of the peace embassy to Caesar, to tell him what was happening. Unless Caesar sent help, they could not hold out any longer. Around midnight, Caesar sent Numidian and Cretan archers and Balearic slingers to help the people of Bibrax, under the leadership of the same men who had come bringing news from Iccius. Their arrival gave the Remi fresh enthusiasm for the fight, as well as hope for the defense, and for the same reason it dispelled the enemy's hope of taking the town. So, after lingering in the vicinity, ravaging the lands of the Remi, and setting fire to all the villages and buildings within reach, the whole Belgic army turned and made for Caesar's camp. They pitched a camp less than 2 miles off, a camp which, as the smoke and fire showed, was more than 7 miles around. At first, because the enemy was so numerous, and because of its outstanding reputation for courage, Caesar avoided giving battle. By means of daily cavalry skirmishes, however, he ascertained how brave they really were, and how daring our men could afford to be. Once he realized that our men were not inferior, he chose a place in front of his camp which was naturally convenient and suitable for forming a battle line. The hill on which the camp was pitched was slightly raised up from the plain, and had enough space in front for a battle line to take up a position at the ready. It sloped steeply on both flanks, but in front rose gently to a ridge and then returned to the level. He constructed a ditch of about 400 paces at right angles from either side of the hill, and at the ends set up outposts and stationed his artillery. Thus, once the battle line was drawn up, despite their numerical strength, the enemy would not be able to fight on the flanks and surround his own men. He then left the two recently enlisted legions in camp, so they could be mobilized as backup if necessary. The remaining 6 he drew up for battle in front of the camp. Likewise, the enemy led their forces out of the camp and deployed them for battle. So just a little sidebar here, so we can cover these past few pages. Caesar has heard of the growing Belgic threat, who are unhappy with Roman interference in Gallic wars and politics. And many of the tribes have taken it upon themselves to form a massive horde. And they intend to give battle to Caesar and the Gauls of the south. Now, upon hearing this, Caesar enlists 2 new legions, so fresh recruits, and takes the rest of his forces and marches north to meet them first. He encounters a tribe called the Remi, who are the most southern of the Belgae, and the Remi basically say, "It's not us. We're not with these guys. We'll prove it to you. We'll surrender you hostages. We'll provide your army with food and fodder, and we'll give you intel." And they do. The Remi deliver. Completely deliver. Not only this, but when a Remi town, Bibrax, becomes under siege by that same Belgic horde, Caesar ensures that men are sent to the defense of their new ally. He will not let them suffer unduly. And it's good that he really does make a great attempt to protect and show the worth of his words. And now he has set up a camp and the battle lines, and it looks like a confrontation is inevitable. So let's go ahead and continue reading. Caesar says, "Between our army and theirs was a small marsh. The enemy waited to see if our men would cross it, but our men were armed and ready to attack them while they were at a disadvantage if they crossed first. Meanwhile, a cavalry battle was taking place between the 2 lines, when neither side took the initiative by crossing first, and when the cavalry battle began to go in our favor, Caesar led his men back to camp. The enemy quickly left and made for the Ain, which was, as explained, behind our camp. There they found fording places and tried to take a division of their forces across, intending, if possible, to storm the outpost where the legate Quintus Titurius was in command and to destroy the bridge. If this proved impossible, they would devastate the land of the Remi, which was so important to our war effort, and cut off our supplies. Once Titurius Sabinus had reported this to Caesar, he then led all the cavalry, the Numidian light-armed troops, slingers, and archers over the bridge and marched towards the enemy. There a fierce battle was fought. Our men attacked the enemy while they were stuck in the water and killed a large number of them. The rest struggled with great daring to make their escape through the midst of the bodies, but were forced back by a shower of missiles. Those who had crossed first were surrounded by our cavalry and cut down. The enemy realized that their hopes of storming the town and crossing the river were a delusion, and observed that our men did not advance to fight on less favorable ground. Moreover, their supplies of corn were starting to run out, so they called a meeting and decided that the best thing would be for each man to return to his own home. Then they could all assemble to defend whichever territory the Roman army invaded first. They could fight better in their own territory than in that belonging to others, and could use their own supplies of corn. They were led to this decision by, among other factors, the consideration that Diviciacus and the Aedui were making for the land of the Belgae, whom it was impossible to persuade to linger where they were, rather than going to the help of their own people. Following this decision, during the second watch, they decamped with much noise and uproar, and no regular ranks or order of command, for each man was trying to be first on the march and hastening to return home. The result was that the departure looked more like a flight. Caesar learned of it at once through his scouts, and feared a trap. As yet, he had no intelligence of the reason for their departure, and so kept the army and cavalry in camp. At first light, once his spies confirmed what had happened, Caesar sent the cavalry on ahead to slow up their rearguard. He put his legates Quintus Pedius and Lucius Auruntius Cotta in charge of them, and ordered his legate Titus Labienus to follow in support with 3 legions. They reached the rearguard and attacked, then pursued them for many miles, and killed a great number as they fled. When our men caught up with those in the rear of the main column, they stood their ground, and courageously repelled our attacks. But those who were further ahead seemed far removed from the danger, and were restrained neither by necessity nor by orders. As soon as they heard the battle cry, they broke ranks and put their hope of safety in flight. The result was that our men, without any risk, killed as many of the enemy as time allowed. At nightfall, they stopped and returned to camp, as ordered. Next day, before the enemy could recover from their panic and flight, Caesar led his army into the territory of the Suessiones, which borders that of the Remi, and by a forced march he made for the town of Novia Dunum. On his arrival, he tried to attack the town, as he had heard it lacked a garrison. Its ditches, however, were very wide, and its walls so high that he was unable to take it by storm, despite the small numbers defending it. He fortified a camp, and began to construct movable shelters, and prepare other equipment for use in siege operations. In the meantime, the Suessiones had returned in full force from the rout and had entered the city in the previous night. The movable shelters were swiftly brought up to the town. Earthworks were erected, and towers set up. Never before had the Gauls seen or heard of such immense siege works, and they were so disturbed by the Roman speed of action that they sent envoys to Caesar to negotiate surrender. The Remi interceded for their safety, and their request was granted. Caesar accepted leading citizens as hostages, including 2 sons of King Galba himself. All the town's weapons were handed over. He accepted the Suessiones' surrender and then led his army against the Belgae. They retreated into the town out of Bradespantium, taking all their property with them. When Caesar and his army were only about 5 miles from the town, all the elders came out and started holding out their hands to him, and shouting that they entrusted themselves to his power and protection, and were not fighting against the Roman people. It was the same when he reached the town and pitched camp there. On the walls, boys and women with outstretched hands pleaded with the Romans for peace, which it was Caesar's custom to grant. After the Belgae's retreat, Diviciacus had dismissed the Aeduan forces and returned to Caesar. Now he interceded on their behalf. The Belgae, he explained, had always been friends and allies of the Aeduan state, by saying that Caesar had enslaved the Aedui and was inflicting insults and indignities upon them. Their leaders had driven them to break off relations with their former allies and make war upon the Roman people. Once they had realized the magnitude of the disaster they had inflicted upon their state, the men who initiated this policy had fled to Britain. Not only the Belgae, but also the Aedui, on their behalf, were begging Caesar to exercise his customary clemency and mercy towards them. If he did so, he would enhance the authority of the Aedui among the Belgae, and the Aedui customarily relied upon their help and assistance in any warfare they undertook. In order to give due respect to Diviciacus and the Aedui, Caesar said that he would spare the Belgae and accept them under his protection, as they were an important nation among the Belgae, with a population of significant size. He called for 600 hostages. Once these were handed over and all the town's weapons gathered in, he left Bradespantium and came to the land of the Ambiani, who straightway surrendered themselves and all their property as well. On the borders of their territory lived the Nervi. When Caesar inquired about their character and customs, he discovered the following. They permitted no merchants within their borders. They did not allow the import of wine and other luxury goods, because they believed such things enfeebled their spirit and weakened their courage. They were fierce men and very brave, who reproached and condemned all the other Belgae for surrendering to the Roman people and casting aside their ancestral courage. They declared that they would send no envoys and accept no peace. Caesar had been marching through their territory for 3 days when he learned from prisoners that the river Sambre was a little more than 9 miles from his camp. On the other side of this river, the Nervi had halted and were awaiting the Romans' arrival, with 2 neighboring peoples whom the Nervi had persuaded to join them in trying their luck in war, namely the Atrebates and the Viromandui. They were all waiting for the forces of the Aduatuci, which were already on their way, and they had sent the women and those men whose age excluded them from battle to a place which was too marshy to be accessible to an army. Once he learned of these events, Caesar sent scouts and centurions on ahead to select a suitable place to encamp. The number of the Belgae and other Gauls who had surrendered were following in Caesar's train and journeying along with our army. Later, Caesar discovered from prisoners that during that time, some of these men were observing our army's usual order of march. They then went by night to the Nervi and explained to them how a large amount of baggage was placed between the individual legions. Once the first legion had entered the camp, and while the other legions were still far behind, they said, it would be no trouble to attack the first legion while it was still encumbered with heavy packs, and once it was routed and all the baggage plundered, the other legions would not dare to resist. The plan of the men who brought this information was helped by the fact that from ancient times the Nervi had never possessed any cavalry, and even now they showed no interest in cavalry, but place whatever strength they do have in infantry. As a result, if the cavalry of neighboring peoples raided their territory, the Nervi could obstruct it all the more easily. They would do this by cutting into trees and bending them down, because of the large number of branches sticking out horizontally, all tangled up with brambles and thorns. They ensured that these hedges provided them with fortification the size of walls. Not only was it impossible to penetrate this barrier, it was even impossible to see through it. As our army's march was being obstructed by these obstacles, the Nervi thought this plan should not be rejected. So what has happened so far? Let's take a little sidebar. Caesar meets the Belgae, the original coalition, and offers battle. And despite some cavalry clashes, which the Romans come out on top of, the Belgae decide that they cannot effectively take the Roman camp. They try to ford the river Ain with a large number of men, but get rebuffed by Caesar and his archers and slingers and his cavalry, and they lose a great number of men in the effort. And because Caesar is staying in his defensive position and his supply lines are secure, while the Belgae, with their giant horde, finds itself in the opposite position, where they aren't able to feed everyone effectively, the Belgae decide that they should split up and go back to their respective tribes. Now, at first, Caesar, of course, thought this was a trap. He sees them running away and he's like, this is bait. Of course it wasn't, and then when he realizes this, he gives chase. I find it very interesting here that Caesar begins approaching several different tribes of the Belgae, and each one in turn immediately surrenders. The first one, the Suessiones, holds out briefly, but when they see the siege works and the weapons of the Romans, they say, you know what, this isn't worth it. And the rest of them, the Bellovaci and the others, don't even wait to be sieged. The Bellovaci in particular, who were an old ally of the Aedui, according to Diviciacus, say that they were roused to battle because they thought the Romans were oppressing the Aedui. And so, despite whatever you might believe to the truth of these claims, Caesar finds himself accepting hostages and granting clemency and leaving their territory to either get terms or give battle to the other Belgic tribes. And he comes at last to one of the most distant tribes of the Gauls, that of the Nervi. And the Nervi, interestingly enough, here's another point I think which surprised me, rely in absolutely no way on cavalry, which is quite a stark contrast to the way that the other Gauls, the Celts, make war, where cavalry is perhaps their point of pride. They lack the heavy infantry that the Romans have. But their skills in horsemanship are very strong. And so they rely on these all the time. But the Nervi alone reject this method of battle. They rely only on infantry and then the natural terrain of their lands to prevent any cavalry from really reaching their full potential, doing a lot of damage. And of these new prisoners that Caesar is taking, it appears that some of them are secretly feeding information to the Nervi. They've given them plans and descriptions of the Roman battle formation, the way their baggage is organized, and describe the best way they think the Romans could be attacked and defeated. Now, it seems that the battle is inevitable once again. The Belgae, not the Belgae, excuse me, the Nervi say that there will be no peace. They will send no envoys and accept no terms. Battle is the only way. So let's continue. Caesar says, "The site which our scouts and centurions chose for the camp was of this kind. A hill sloped down from its summit at an even gradient, along the edge of the Sambre, which we mentioned above. Another hill sloped up from the river at a similar gradient, opposite our hill and facing it directly, clear and open for about 200 paces, but wooded higher up so that it was difficult to see within. The enemy concealed themselves in these woods. Down the river on the open ground, a few cavalry posts were visible. The river was about 3 feet deep. Caesar sent his cavalry on ahead, and then followed with all his forces. But he employed a different order and strategy of march than from the previous one the Belgae had reported to the Nervi. Because he was approaching an enemy, Caesar was, as usual, leading the 6 legions carrying only light kit. He had put the whole army's baggage behind the legions, while the 2 legions most recently enlisted brought up the rear of the whole column and acted as a rearguard for the baggage. Our cavalry, slingers, and archers crossed the river and engaged with the enemy cavalry, who continually retreated into the woods and rejoined their comrades before coming out of the trees and attacking our men again. When the enemy retreated, our men dared not pursue the attack beyond the extent of level and open ground. Meanwhile, the 6 legions had already arrived, measured out the camp, and begun the work of fortification. The enemy formed up in battle order within the woods, and strengthened their resolve. As soon as our army's baggage came into view of the enemy hidden in the woods, the moment they had agreed for joining battle, they suddenly rushed out in full force and launched an attack on our cavalry, which was easily repulsed and scattered. The enemy then ran at astonishing speed down to the river, and so seemed, almost at one in the same moment, to be near the woods, then in the river, and now already upon us. With similar speed, they made their way up the hill to our camp, and attacked the men who were working on the fortifications. And so, for those who didn't catch it, the Nervi drew up to their battle lines in the woods. out of sight of the Romans. And when the Romans had started to pitch camp, this is when they chose to strike. The river, again, was very shallow. Caesar says it was only 3 feet deep. And this is when the enemy comes and charges across the plains and through the river and straight up to the Roman lines. So let's continue. Caesar had to see to everything at once. The flag must be unfurled. This was the signal to stand to arms. The trumpet sounded. The soldiers must be recalled from working on the defenses, and all those who had gone some way off in search of material for the earthworks had to be ordered back to camp. He must draw up his battle line, encourage the men, give the signal. There was too little time. The enemy pressed on so fast to complete these arrangements. 2 factors counterbalanced these difficulties. The first was the knowledge and experience of Caesar's men. Their training in previous battles had taught them what needed to be done, so that they could just as easily devise their own orders as receive them from others. Secondly, Caesar had forbidden any of his officers to abandon either the defense works or their individual legions before the fortification of the camp was complete. And in fact, the enemy was so close at hand and moving so swiftly that these officers no longer thought of waiting for Caesar's orders, but began to make dispositions of their own accord, as seemed necessary. Once he had given all the appropriate orders, Caesar ran down where luck would take him to speak his encouragement to the men, and ended up among the 10th Legion. His speech was long enough only to urge them to remember their long-established record for bravery, and not to lose their nerve, but to resist the enemy assault with courage, for the enemy was within missile range of the Roman army. Then he gave the signal for battle. When Caesar moved to the other side to give encouragement, he found the men already fighting. Everything happened so quickly, and the enemy were so determined to fight that there was no time for our men to fit on their emblems, or even put on helmets and take the covers from their shields. Wherever each man ended up after stopping work on the defenses, and whichever signal he saw first, there he took his stand, so as not to waste fighting time in looking for his comrades. The Roman army was drawn up so as to take account of the natural terrain, the slope of the hill, and the need of the moment, rather than in accordance with any theoretical military formation. For the legions were resisting the enemy in different directions and at different places, while the thick barrier hedges we mentioned before got in their way and obscured their view. It was impossible to allocate assistance or see what was needed where, or for one man to coordinate all commands. The difficult circumstances, therefore, were matched by a number of different outcomes. The soldiers of the 9th and 10th legions had placed themselves on the left flank. They threw their spears and charged upon the Atrebates, whom they happened to be facing. The Atrebates were fatigued and exhausted after running, and suffering from their wounds. Our men, who had the higher ground, quickly forced them into the river. The Atrebates tried to get across, but their way was blocked. Our men caught them up, drew their swords, and slaughtered many of them. Then our men crossed the river without hesitation. They advanced on to unfavorable ground. The enemy resisted. Battle began again, and again they routed the enemy. Elsewhere, 2 other legions, the 11th and the 8th, engaged with the Viromandui and overcame them. They then left the higher ground and began to fight actually on the riverbank. Now, although the 12th were on the right flank, and the 7th not far off, to the front and on the left, the camp was almost completely exposed. Under the leadership of their supreme commander, Bodunatus, the Nervi formed up into a dense, compact column and marched upon this part of the camp. Some of them began to encircle the legions on their exposed left flank. The rest made for the higher ground on which the camp stood. I mentioned earlier that the enemy's first assault had routed our cavalry and the light infantry which had accompanied it. When these forces of ours returned to camp, they ran up against the enemy advance and again tried to flee elsewhere. From the main entrance gate on the crest of the hill, the orderlies had seen our men cross the river victorious, and had then gone out in search of plunder. But when they saw the enemy moving about in our camp, they took their heels and fled. At that moment, a roar of confusion went up from the men marching with the baggage train, and frightened soldiers started to flee in all directions. All this served to terrify the cavalry of the Treveri, who have a reputation for outstanding bravery among the Gauls. They had been sent out by their people as reinforcements and had come to Caesar. When, however, they saw the enemy swarming all over our camp, our legions hard-pressed and on the point of being surrounded, our orderlies, cavalry, slingers, and Numidians spread out, scattered, fleeing in all directions. They then abandoned hope for our cause and made their way home. The Romans were beaten, they announced, to their fellow citizens. The Romans were overcome. The Nervi had taken possession of their camp and the baggage. After his words of encouragement to the 10th, Caesar made his way to the right flank. There he saw that his soldiers were hard-pressed. Because their standards were crowded together, the men of the 12th were packed so close that they obstructed one another in fighting. All the centurions of the 4th cohort were dead. The standard-bearer was slain. The standard lost. All but a few centurions from the rest of the cohorts were wounded or dead. Among the casualties was a senior centurion called Publius Sextius Bacchus, a man of immense courage, who was suffering from numerous serious wounds. He could no longer stand upright, and the rest of the men were weakening. Some of those at the rear were leaving the battle and retreating to avoid missiles, while the enemy did not slacken, but pressed up on the hill in front, and continued to attack on both flanks. Caesar realized that the outcome rested on a knife's edge. There was no hope of reinforcements, so he snatched a shield from one of the soldiers at the rear. He had come out without his own shield, and made his way to the front line. There he called upon the centurions by name and encouraged the men, ordering them to advance and open ranks so they could use their swords more easily. His coming gave the men fresh hope and heartened them. Each one was eager of his own accord to do well in his commander's sight, even at great personal risk, and the enemy assault was checked a little. Caesar now saw that the 7th Legion too, which had taken up position beside the 12th, was being hard-pressed by the enemy. He ordered the military tribunes to close their legions up gradually, wheel about, and attack the enemy. By this means, since they could all support one another and need not fear being attacked by the enemy from behind, they began to resist with greater daring, and to fight more bravely. Meanwhile, the soldiers from the 2 legions which had been at the rear of the column to guard the baggage heard of the battle. They sped forward and came into enemy view on top of the hill. Titus Labienus, who had taken over the enemy camp from his vantage point, saw what was happening in our camp, sent the 10th Legion to our men's assistance. When the men of the 10th discovered from the fleeing cavalry and orderlies where the fighting was, and the extent of the danger which now threatened the camp, the legions and their commander, they left nothing undone in terms of speed. Their arrival transformed our fortunes. so much so that our men, even those who lay wounded, supported themselves on their shields and began the fight afresh. The orderlies now observed that it was the Nervi who were afraid, and, weaponless as they were, they charged upon the armed enemy. So too the cavalry tried to wipe out the shame of its desertion by fighting everywhere in an attempt to outdo the legionaries. The enemy, however, even at this critical moment, showed such determination that their bravery, that when those in the front rank had fallen, the men behind them stood upon the slain and continued the fight from on top of the corpses. When they were overthrown, the pile of bodies grew even higher, while the survivors used the heap as a vantage point for throwing missiles at our men or catching their spears and throwing them back. Not without good reason were they judged to be men of enormous bravery, for they had dared to cross a very wide river, climb its steep banks, and advance on extremely difficult ground. The Nervi's courage had made light of these obstacles. When the battle was over, the name and fighting strength of the Nervi were almost wiped out. We mentioned earlier that the elders were gathered together in inlets and marshes along with the women and children. When news came of the battle, they assumed that nothing stood in the way of the victors, and that for the vanquished nothing was secure. So all the survivors agreed to send envoys to Caesar and surrendered to him. Describing the disaster which had befallen them, the Nervian envoys declared that they had been reduced from 600 senators to 3. From 60,000 men capable of active service to a mere 500. Caesar was eager to preserve their safety and to be seen to exercise clemency towards the wretched people who were pleading with him. He ordered them to confine themselves to their own territories and towns, and commanded their neighbors to refrain from doing the Nervi and their people harm or injury. We described the Aduatuci above. They were on their way to assist the Nervi in full force when news of the battle made them give up their march and return home. They abandoned all their towns and strongholds, and brought all their property to one town which had superb natural defenses. All along its circumference it presented sheer cliffs and heights, which at one spot left a gently approaching slope. A gently sloping approach. No more than 200 feet wide. This the Aduatuci had strengthened by a high double wall, and were even now putting heavy rocks and sharpened stakes along its length. The Aduatuci were descendants of those Cimbri and Teutoni who, when marching into our province in Italy, had left all the cattle and baggage they could not drive or carry with them on this side of the Rhine. They left a guard, 6,000 of their men, to protect it. Following the destruction of the main force, these men were harassed by neighboring peoples, sometimes attacking, sometimes defending. Eventually, peace was made by common consent, and they selected this place to settle on. So let's take a sidebar here. Wow, a lot just happened. And it's kind of hard to imagine when you're just listening to it without any kind of visual aid, because so much is happening all at once. And there's a back and forth in several different locations that it can be hard to understand. Now, the Nervi had come out and attacked with such speed that the Romans could not form a normal battle line. Again, they were mostly setting up preparations for the camp. They had their shields still in their wraps. They were not expecting to be attacked. They were in building mode, you could say. And they're not, in some cases, even with their normal comrades. Some of them are around in other places of the camp, trying to get things built, trying to secure their own fortifications. And so the Nervi attack forces the Roman line to basically become kind of a hodgepodge of people who aren't where they would normally belong. But such is the discipline of the legions, and such is their experience, that even without getting orders from Caesar, even without waiting for any horn or call, they themselves, they take it upon themselves to make decisions, to know what's going on and know what needs to be done. And so on the left flank in particular, especially the 10th Legion, among others, not only do the Romans form up, but they also push the Nervi and their allies back to such an extent that they force them to retreat and they chase them across the river. Caesar, of course, is stuck on the right helping the other legions, the 12th, and I believe it was the 7th. And the fighting is so desperate that Caesar himself grabs a shield and joins in the fray. The actual general, the proconsul of Rome, he himself grabs a shield and starts fighting. And this has a great effect on his troops. They see their own commander in the fray with them. He's not some distant general just watching it all happen. He's there and he's shouting. And he's trying to get everyone to come together and fight. Now, while this is going on, another column of the Nervi break through in the center, and they start storming the Roman camp. And because there was initial success on the left flank, it appears that a lot of the orderlies and the people, like the non-soldiers in the camp had already gone out and they had started to plunder and they try to take things off the bodies of the Gauls and things like that. And so they were completely unprepared for this second offensive by the Nervi. And this was very brief, but there was another tribe involved, right? And they were called the Treveri. And the Treveri were actually supposed to help the Romans. But upon seeing that the Nervi had overtaken the Roman camp, the Treveri leave the Romans to fend for themselves. They say, why should we get involved in this? They're basically already dead, right? Oh dear. Oh, the Treveri. And so they turn around and they just go back home. If you heard a little clank there, I have 2 glasses of water this time. Because, man, do I drink a lot when I'm doing these little history casts with you guys. Holy moly. All right, so now Caesar's attacking a different tribe. The Nervi are defeated. Essentially, of the 60,000 fighting men, they've been reduced to 500, which is incredible. And he calls them senators. I don't know if the Nervi would have called them the same word, or if you can think of them as like Roman senators, but they're ruling class. Of 600 of them, only 3 remain. So the Nervi are basically a non-entity at this point. And so the Aduatuci are next. They were on their way to help the Nervi, but arrived late, and so they decided to go back to their territory, abandon all their towns and forts except for one, where they all met up and decided to give battle. So, let us continue. As soon as our army arrived, the Aduatuci began making frequent sallies from the town and skirmishing with our men. Later, when they were shut in by a rampart 4.5 miles in length, with numerous forts along it, they remained in the town. Movable shelters were drawn up, and earthwork built, and when the Aduatuci saw a siege tower constructed in the distance, at first they stood on the wall, mocking and jeering that such a large apparatus was being put together so far off. What hands, what strength were men of such puny stature relying on to move this huge and heavy tower against their wall? For the main part, Gauls are very tall, and hold our slighter build in contempt. But when they saw the tower being moved, and coming close to the walls, the sight of it was so unusual and unexpected that it prompted them to send envoys to Caesar to ask for peace. The envoys spoke to the effect that in their opinion the Romans had divine help in waging war to enable them to move such tall structures forward so quickly. And so they declared they surrendered themselves and all their possessions to the Romans' control. They begged and pleaded for only one favor, if perhaps his clemency and mercy, of which they had heard from others, were to prompt Caesar to spare them, not to be deprived of their weapons. Almost all their neighbors were hostile and looked on their courage with unfriendly eyes. The Aduatuci could not protect themselves against these people without weapons. They would rather endure any fate at the hands of the Roman people, if brought to such a pass, than be tortured and killed by peoples among whom they had once reigned supreme. Caesar answered them that he would spare their state, more because this would accord with habitual practice than because of their merit, if they surrendered before the battering ram touched the wall. There could, however, be no formal surrender unless they gave up their weapons. Instead, he would do for them what he had done for the Nervi, and would order the neighboring peoples not to harm subjects of the Roman people. His offer was reported back to the Aduatuci, and they agreed to obey. They threw a large number of weapons down from the wall into the ditch in front of the town. The piles of arms were almost as high as the wall and mound. Even so, it was revealed later that about a third of their weapons had been concealed and kept in the town. They opened their gates and for that day enjoyed peace. When night fell, Caesar gave orders for the gates to be closed and the soldiers to leave the town, to prevent the soldiers doing the inhabitants any harm by night. But the Aduatuci were acting on a predetermined plan, it seemed, in the belief that after the surrender our men would withdraw their guards, or at least keep watch rather less carefully. They equipped themselves with the weapons they had kept concealed, with the shields which, as the pressure of time demanded, were made in haste, of bark or wicker covered with hides. At the third watch, they suddenly burst out of the town in full strength and attacked where the climb up to our defense works was the least steep. As Caesar had already ordered, a fire signal was immediately given. Men ran to assemble from the nearest forts. The enemy fought as fiercely as brave men might be expected to when clinging to their last hope of safety, on difficult ground against the Romans, throwing missiles at them from the rampart and towers, and when their only hope of survival lay in courage alone. About 4,000 men were killed, and the rest forced back into the town. Next day, the gates were broken open, for there was no one to defend them. Caesar sent our soldiers inside, and sold everything in the town in one lot. The buyers reported to him a sale numbering 53,000 people. At the same time, Publius Crassus, whom Caesar had sent with a legion against the Veneti, Venelli, Assismi, Curiasalate, Esubi, Alurci, and Rhodonis, the coastal states beside the ocean, sent him news that all those states had been brought under the power and dominion of the Roman people. Once this action was over, the whole of Gaul was pacified. The fame of this war spread among the barbarians, and was so impressive that the peoples living on the other side of the Rhine sent envoys to Caesar. They promised to give him hostages and to obey his commands. He was, however, in a hurry to reach Italy and Illyricum, and so told the embassies to return to him at the start of the following summer. Then he took the legions to their winter quarters in the lands of the Carnutus, Andes, and Turonis, and the other states near to the area where he had been campaigning. He himself set out for Italy. Because of these achievements reported in a letter from Caesar, a thanksgiving of 15 days was decreed. This had never been granted to anyone else before. And so comes to an end the second book of Julius Caesar's The Gallic War. This all took place in the same year, so this was all in 57 BC. And there's a lot to talk about here. So this is the completion of the second year of Caesar's proconsulship, his governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. And Illyricum, he just mentioned it just now. Illyricum really has nothing to do with the Gallic War. However, as we'll see, well, Caesar doesn't really understand this right now because this won't become very much of an issue until after his assassination, but his focus on Gaul and the revolts in Gaul will take up so much of his effort that Illyricum will be sadly rejected. And this will cause more problems for the Roman subjects living in Illyria down the road, but I digress. There's several things that are mentioned in this chapter that are worth noting. One of the first things is the mention of Britain. I believe this was the first time that Britain was mentioned, the Isle of Britannia. And you can remember that at this point, Britain was basically an unknown island somewhere off the coast of Gaul. No Roman had ever been there. And so there was a lot of fiction and mystery and kind of wild ideals about the British Isles and the people who inhabited them, their wealth, their courage. But Britain was not unknown to the Gauls, and the Belgae in particular had relations. Some of the tribes Caesar mentioned even had cities in Britain and close connections. And so when certain plots were revealed, Caesar mentions that the makers of these plots actually fled to Britain. And so he has some reason to go there later. So is it just propaganda? I don't think so. It's not entirely without reason. It wasn't a pleasure cruise. But that is not for today. That's for later. We will read about Britain soon enough. It's somewhat futile to play what-if games with history. After all, we'll never know. History only unfolds one way, and as much as we can ask, what if Caesar had never been assassinated? What if the Americans had lost the Revolutionary War? You could create all sorts of scenarios here, these alternative history scenarios. But I think one of the the scenarios we can ask ourselves here is, what if the Belgae never made a confederacy? Again, Caesar, by this point, has already achieved 2 enormous victories. Like we said earlier at the very beginning of the stream, over the Nervi and the Nervi allies, and over Ariovistus. He has brought tribes under control and under the protection of Rome. This in and of itself is already enough to warrant, you could argue, a triumph. It has enhanced his popularity enormously. He has enhanced to the power of one of his closest allies, or Rome's closest allies, the Aedui. And it seems that if the Belgae could have left well enough alone, Caesar would have had no cause for war to go any further in Gaul. But some people will say, well, no, he was planning to invade anyway. And I don't know about that. Was he really? On what basis do you make that judgment? I, for one, don't feel comfortable saying what Caesar would or would not have done if faced with a pacified Belgae who did not mobilize and, or rather, with the intent of fighting and defeating the Romans. Now, there's a lot that happens here that's kind of mentioned briefly, but at the very end, we have Publius Crassus was mentioned. So Publius Crassus is the son of Marcus Crassus, who is one of Caesar's allies that create the first triumvirate. We talked a little bit about it in the first stream when we mentioned Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. And Publius is his son, and he serves Caesar in Gaul. And Publius was sent just with one legion to the northwest coast of Gaul to get the other tribes there and prevent a similar situation from arising. And he was successful. He negotiated deals with all of the tribes. They surrendered hostages. They agreed not to be aggressive towards the Romans. And so it seemed there's almost a bit of finality in this chapter, right? It almost feels like this is the end. I'll read it again, this very last section. Once this action was over, the whole of Gaul was pacified. The fame of this war spread among the barbarians, and was so impressive that the peoples living on the other side of the Rhine sent envoys to Caesar. They promised to give him hostages and to obey his commands. He was, however, in a hurry to reach Italy and Illyricum, and so told the embassies to return to him at the start of the following summer. Then he took the legions to their winter quarters in the lands of the Carnutes, Andes, and the Turonis, and the other states near to the area where he had been campaigning. He himself set out for Italy. Because of these achievements reported in a letter from Caesar, a thanksgiving of 15 days was decreed. This had never been granted to anyone before. Just listen to how that's written. Gaul is pacified. Word and emissaries are coming from the tribes across the Rhine. The legions are returning to their winter quarters, victorious. There are celebrations in Rome. And you could be forgiven for thinking like, wow, it sounds like it's over. What could possibly happen next? I'll read to you all the title of the third book here. We're going to be doing this next week. I'm wanting to take this one book at a time as much as I can, so we just don't overload our senses or our brains with the information that comes in here, because these are very detailed accounts, as you can see. So the third book, which kind of betrays the last two paragraphs of the one we just read, is titled Campaigning Against Maritime Tribes, Crassus in Aquitania. So even though we just mentioned these maritime tribes, it seems that the negotiations were not all as successful as they were cracked up to be. Aussie says, I am a simple Twitch user, can only handle so many books. Me too. I'm a simple Twitch streamer. I can only handle reading so much. There's some people, there are many people, who will make the argument that at this point, even still, Caesar's pretty much just in it for the money. He has debts to pay, so he's just going to go to war and get money. But these last wars that he just fought have made him immensely rich. Think of this, the very last tribe he's fighting. Remember, the Nervi are defeated. And Caesar goes to fight the Ottawatuki, who surrender to him. And then this is going to become a very common trope with the Gauls is fake surrenders. Like, oh, hey, we surrender. Here's our weapons. Let's get a peace. Just kidding. And then they rush out and attack. This is the most Gallic of Gallic strategies. 100%. This is what they do. But this is kind of the first time it really happens. And even though Caesar was content to give them peace, the Ottawatuki apparently were so hated by their neighbors that they said, look, if you leave us without our weapons, our neighbors are going to come and conquer us. Because the Ottawatuki were just that unpopular with even the other Belgae, the other Gauls. And so they just attack, and as a result, Caesar storms the town, he takes every single person in there, all the possessions, and he sells everything, including the people. Again, slavery was a big part of the Roman economy, and he mentions that he sold 53,000 Gauls in one lot. That means in one lot, in one go. This wasn't like broken up, oh, we sold 10,000 a day, and then someone else came by and we sold another, 5,000, then 20,000. It's just one lot. It kind of makes you appreciate that when an army of antiquity is moving around, it's not just the army, right? You have the army, you have the soldiers, the legionaries, you have the auxiliaries, right? He has Numidian cavalry, he has Gallic archers, he has all this, the fighting forces, the cavalry, and all this and other stuff. But he also has the support crew, the orderlies, as he calls them. I mean, think of it. You need blacksmiths. You need orderlies to set things up. People to write, messengers. You have the baggage train, so people to manage the baggage train and the soldiers' baggage. I mean, imagine in a modern war, right? That when an army takes a town and they get loot or they get booty in some way, and they go back to base and they probably keep it there. But these ancient armies, they're always on the move. So they got to keep their possessions with them, which means probably each soldier has something like a locker or something that goes with the baggage train. And so if he gets something he wants to keep, he just stuffs it in the locker. So you can imagine that these baggage trains are immensely prized. If you can seize the enemy's baggage, you're feeling pretty good. There's a lot of wealth in there. But I digress. That's it's not just the baggage trains, but there's also slavers. I mean, think about it. He's got all these Gauls that he just captured. And if you're a slaver operating in the ancient world, well, where's the best place to go to buy slaves at a good price? Well, if you follow an army around and the army wins, you're like, and they got these prisoners, so they're like, hey, I know you don't want to take these prisoners everywhere you go, I'll buy them. And it's mutually beneficial, right? The army commander can make a pretty penny. He's relieved of having to take care and feed and do this, that, and the other thing for his prisoners. He can focus on the army. The prisoners, of course, will slow them down, and then the slavers themselves get fresh slaves. They can bring them back to Italy, or they can go to the provinces, and they can start selling them in Roman cities all across the empire, probably eventually reaching Rome. I'm no expert on the route that slavers took in the ancient world, but it seems like if that was the kind of business you were in, this is exactly the kind of place you would want to be. And man, did it probably make them some money. Now, I'm assuming that they didn't just have these chests of gold going around, and maybe they did. I'm wondering if they had some notes or writs or guarantees or something that they would pass around for credit was it a credit and debt kind of thing where it would be negotiated that way between the slavers and the army? It's a very interesting thing that I would love to study more. As morbid as it might be. So that is it for today. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me. It was another fun read. The third book, and from this point forward, we're going to be seeing a different page, a different leaf being turned in this conflict. Up until this point, remember, it's Gallic aggression or Gallic invitation that's gotten the Romans involved. But now Rome has become a serious power broker in Gaul. They've become established to the point where now, just like the Helvetii, there's a lot of weak tribes because they've been defeated. They've lost a lot of their fighting men who are relying on the Romans to protect them. The Romans now have treaties with not just Gallic tribes on the border of Roman territory, but much further in. They have treaties with the Remi, who are all the way in Belgae. They've got treaties with the surrounding people and with the Aedui. So now the territory that they're responsible for has vastly increased. And we can see that with this increased responsibility and duty for these treaties that Caesar has created, it means that the Romans, more likely than not, are going to be here to stay to enforce these treaties that have been made. And how will the Gauls react to this? That is the big question that we will come to read next time in Book 3. I want to thank you, everyone, for coming in today. If you are watching on YouTube, of course, remember to like and subscribe. You can join us every Wednesday on Twitch, twitch.tv/AuthorValentine. And you can join the chat, join the conversation. If you're on Twitch, thank you for joining me. Hope to see you guys next week. You can also follow on YouTube if you haven't already. If you were joining late, you can, of course, catch the full thing when I upload it. Thank you again, everyone, for your support. I hope to see you again next time. You have a great rest of your days, evenings, and mornings as they may be, and I will see you next week.